On the quirks of the U.S. Constitution and other countries' basic laws, let's talk to James Boyce in London. He's a senior research fellow at King's College London and an expert on U.S. policy. James, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera. Tell us more first about some of the requirements to be U.S. president. Any quirks there, like in Egypt or Tunisia, for instance?
Well, it's interesting, and it's vital to remember, of course, that every nation's constitution is very much a product of the age in which it was produced. So we now have this bizarre situation whereby the world's leading superpower is effectively governed by an 18th century document. When we look at the age requirement, for example, 35 sounds quite young to be President of the United States. But when you consider this was written in the late 1700s, 35, of course, was not necessarily as young an age as we may imagine now. We also need to recall, of course, the fact that whilst the election is going to be held on Tuesday night, and we'll no doubt be analysing the results on Wednesday morning, officially the United States president will not be elected until the Electoral College meets on January 6th, because the American people do not vote directly for the president, but rather for electors to an Electoral College.
Indeed, and I think what many people outside the U.S. find hard to grasp and understand is the fact that, the president who wins the popular vote cannot be president in the end, like was the case in 2000 with George W. Bush.
Absolutely. That happens very rarely in American history, but it has happened on a number of occasions, and we saw that played out in 2000. Al Gore's protest against that result, of course, was not due to the fact that he felt he should be president because he'd won the popular vote by some 500,000, but because of potential problems in the Florida recount situation. So legally, it's quite accepted that the Electoral College does take precedent, and this allows for the continued relevance of smaller states, but it has, of course, skewed this. So, for example, now we know that really 2/3 of the US is kind of irrelevant. We know that 1/3 will vote for the Democrats, 1/3 will vote for the Republicans,
right.
And it's those key swing states that we need to focus on because of the Electoral College.
And speaking of the swing states, James, what if the Electoral College vote is a tie after the election? Of course, we're not going to find this out on the day after the election, but what if there is a tie? What if, 500 of the 538 electors, 267 and 267, what if it's an equal tie? What happens then?
Well, if you thought 2000 was a mess, then it would be even worse if that were to happen, because then what would happen is that it would swing to Congress. And at that point, you end up with one chamber deciding who will be president, the House of Representatives, and the Senate deciding who will be vice president. So you could end up with the perverse situation of a President Romney and a Vice President Joe Biden. I'm not expecting that to happen, but anything can happen with the American Constitution because of its fluid nature, shall we say.
All right, let's widen this out a bit, James. How do the requirement criteria differ from region to region, or perhaps from the so-called new democracies to countries with more established democratic credentials? Does it vary a lot?
Well, what you see is that when most nations try to draft a constitution, they try to look at other nations as a foundation. It's a lot easier to try to copy or emulate an existing document. So the American Constitution gets used an awful lot as a foundation for other nations' procedural documents moving forward. So we've seen this played out in the former Soviet nations, for example. But all constitutions are written in times of crisis, at a turning point in history, and are kind of written with regards to being against something, against a process which has happened. So we've seen this, for example, in Tunisia and in Egypt, where they're both being written against a former backdrop of dictatorship, so they're trying to be perhaps more inclusive. But you've seen, for example, ambiguities, so discussions of not having foreign-born spouses, having to reject passports of a foreign nation, for example. So there is a certain degree to which there are problematic elements to all constitutions. And let's not forget, the American Constitution itself was very much a compromise between those large states and the 13 colonies and the smaller colonies at that time. There's also problems with regards to issues of race, in which African Americans were seen initially to be worth 2/3 of a popular vote. So these are all problems which the American people had to overcome in the 250-odd years since it came to ratification.
All right, interesting stuff. Thank you very much, James, for your insight. That's James Boyce, Senior Research Fellow at King's College London, joining us there. Thanks for your time.